Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. All right, so we were back here with Dr. Chris Moorman from North Carolina State University, and as we told you last time that you heard from him, he was my major advisor. He also has done a ton of work with some of our key management practices in the Southeast that affect turkeys, namely prescribed fire. Done a bunch of work. Some of that work I was participating in, and we wanted to have you on today, Chris, to talk about burning and the timing of burning, particularly as it's related to nesting, because there's a lot of concern, and this is definitely one of those issues that creates some division between people in our community that care about turkeys. So we wanted to go right to the source, because you've been a party to a lot of the research, not just with turkeys, on several species, and we wanted to talk to you about that. But I was wondering, Will and I, we kind of made a note of it in a previous episode that we wanted to talk to you about one of our hunting experiences. And I just made note that it'd be fun to hear your version of I think it was the first time we turkey hunted together, it was during some of these research projects we're going to talk about. I was curious if you could tell us the short version of the story when you used, I think it was my shotgun, to shoot a big tom. When we were hunting together.
So I grew up in a time when I'm getting a little older, so I grew up in a time when there weren't really any turkeys or deer, at least where I live. So as a kid, we didn't hunt big game. We hunted doves and squirrels mostly. Mm-hmm. So, turkeys are around now, and I have a project on turkeys on Fort Bragg Military Installation, and it's paired with a bunch of other projects on fox squirrels and white-tailed deer and coyotes. And, we have a big group of students, and Marcus he's one of the students studying white-tailed deer. So the wild turkey student is also there. So there's sort of a lot of integrated effort. And, I'm maybe down there working with the wild turkey student, and Marcus is like, hey, when y'all are done, do you want to go turkey hunting? Because it was maybe in between their deer trapping efforts or whatever. And I had never killed a turkey. And I believe Marcus had already killed his two bird state limit at this point on Fort Bragg. So he said he would take me out and guide me, and he had a bird marked that he said he thought was a good target. So we got in there and set up, and lo and behold, turkey started gobbling in every direction. He goes, "That's not the one. That's not the one. That's not the one. That's not the one." And turkeys are still gobbling, and he goes, "Oh, that's the one." And I think we might have heard 8 different birds gobble that morning in every direction. And Marcus is guiding me. He told me what tree to get on. He told me where the turkey was going to walk most likely. And he told me when the turkey was on the ground, because I was having trouble distinguishing when it was in the tree or on the ground. He told me to be still because the turkey was looking at us. And then I saw its little head had popped up over a rise. We're in the Sandhills region, which has some topography. I knew I was using his gun, which was funny. The gun was huge to me. I was like, I felt like I was wielding a giant, tree. And the bird, I knew when it was time to shoot, and I just said, "Hey, you got to stop him." And Marcus stopped the bird, and I shot him. And what was interesting is that while the bird was gobbling, and maybe while it was on the ground coming to us, there was somebody else, another hunter, had showed up a couple of 100 yards away. We couldn't see him, but we could hear him doing his crow call, or his barred owl call with a crow call. And every time he would do it, real. every
No
time he would
way.
do it, the turkey
Yes.
would go, 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 go. And
was
he'd
go-
do it again and again and again. The turkey would gobble every time.
Positive or I guess
And
negative
we
reinforcement.
were thinking,
right
why does
there.
he keep doing that? He knows where the turkey is. And luckily, he kept doing it because I shot the turkey. We ran over, got the turkey, turned around, and started to walk out. And at that exact moment, he drove in right to
Yes.
where the turkey was, which certainly
He
he would
would
never
have
kill the
definitely-
turkey.
Yeah, he would have bumped him. Like
Yeah, so it was a
drove
matter of
up to within
minutes. Yeah.
drove up to within 50 yards in a pine savanna where you can see forever.
Yeah.
He drives up just right after the turkey.
Yeah.
So-
So that's public land hunting. So that, it was a great experience, but it was apparently a mature bird, long spurs, everything great. So it was exciting.
So
My first turkey.
just so I make sure I got the story straight, he was using a barred owl's rhythm on a crow locator
Yeah.
call.
It would literally sound. It was a crow call,
Yeah.
and he was going, "Oh, oh, oh, oh," and it sounded like a crow.
Maybe
And the
he's
turkey-
on. Maybe he's on to something.
Yeah, the turkeys were just firing off in every direction.
Yeah.
It was just one of those mornings, and
Yeah.
and we were in kind of the honey hole, so to speak, and I knew a lot about the turkeys in that area because I had been spending so much time with them, and I forgot about that part, Chris. I'm glad you brought that in. I actually know who the individual was.
You do.
Yes, I do. I remember.
What was
the
funny
name.
was he was putting his turkey, he was putting his camo on at his truck as we walked by with a turkey. I had a turkey hanging over my shoulder. So
Yeah.
it was fun.
Nice.
Yeah,
And Marcus even took it to the next level. Now, I was his PhD advisor, so he probably owed me. But he actually got back and he actually prepped that bird. He did the full skin where he skinned out the whole back into the tail fan. So I still have that bird hanging on my wall
yeah,
with that
that's
full
awesome.
prep. People are always impressed with that.
Yeah,
Nice.
full like a caped it all the way out, so
Yeah.
it has the full thing all the way down to the neck. Yeah, I really like doing that with birds, and kind of using them as keepsakes to remember the different experiences. I think they're beautiful, and we try to use as much of them as we can.
Yeah, the hunt extends well beyond the harvest. So
Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah, I bet it was delicious too.
Oh, yeah. Excellent. I hunt to eat mostly. So, if it has big antlers or long spurs, that's always just a side benefit. I'm there to
Yeah.
eat it.
Well, one of the things that we noted, I haven't told the story from my perspective, but I remember a few things a little differently.
You're going to say my finger moved a bunch or something. I don't know.
So,
I was checking the safety.
So you can imagine being in, and this was that old Mossberg that we were talking about on. I think we talked about it on the air.
I've got the same one.
Yeah, it literally is like 7 foot long. The shotgun, and it's heavy, and Chris wasn't used to that, I guess.
I like a 26-inch barrel on my shotgun, so yeah, that was.
Well, this one's like a 32-inch barrel with an extender for the choke, and and it's got the rail on it, and it's just massive. It feels like, but man, I've killed a bunch of turkeys with that thing.
If yours is like mine, it's got a nice rattle to it too.
Yeah. It's been trusty though, man. I put that thing through a beating for a long time, and it's still been really reliable. So I'll just tell a few little tidbits. So you imagine we're in a pine savanna, so we've gotten as close as we can because I already knew a lot about the birds, but we were still a couple hundred yards from them, when they were going to fly down, and we're sitting on this giant pine tree in the middle of the wide open on the side of a hill. And, we would be able to see the turkey in some directions from hundreds of yards away. So I was kind of sitting to the right of Chris, sort of set behind him on the pine, but I'm looking across his face, and he's got the shotgun kind of pointing down the hill, and the turkeys are kind of diagonal to our left. So I'm looking across Chris toward the turkeys, and I knew when they flew down, and I saw those white cotton balls pop up. There was two longbeards together, and they popped up, and that's when we started, with I can see them, they can see us, you be still. And I guess that shotgun has a thumb, safety.
Yeah.
And, meanwhile, we've got at first they were probably 200 yards away. I could barely see them. And then they were they're coming on a string right to us. And Chris is literally pointing to where they're going to cross in front of us at 20 yards. He's already got a shotgun sitting there pointing at it. And we've got this big pine tree that they're going to have to walk behind, so he's going to be able to move or do anything he needs to right before they pop out. And I remember looking over it, and I know that he was getting fired up, and I could, we could just feel, how that feels when you like this is about to go down right now in the middle of this place, and we've got this dude over here that's trying to screw it up, and we're like we're just right in the moment, and it seemed like for an hour, that all this was playing down. It was reality. It was a couple minutes, but I remember looking over Chris, and he was checking his safety to make sure he had it off. But I think it was a nervous habit because I remember saying, "Chris, they can see us. Stop moving. Chris, stop moving. Stop moving. Chris, the safety's off. Stop moving." And then finally I was like, "Chris," just plain voice, "Chris, stop moving." And I just remember, from my perspective, I felt like he was just so excited. He couldn't stand it. And he's breathing hard and everything. And it was so fun to, especially with Chris, like we're out in the woods and the turkeys are gobbling, and he's like, "Well, damn, did you hear that whippoorwill?" And he's like, "Shit, I got 47 species of birds on my bird list." And I was like, "Chris, the turkeys are gobbling. Like, what are you? I don't give a damn about about the
I think they were
whippoorwill."
Chuck Will's widows, and they were so loud
Yeah.
we couldn't hardly hear it. We couldn't hear the turkeys gobbling.
It was amazing because the woods had just lit up, and Chris has heard every bird that is in the county with us. He's got them all on his list. And I'm worried about one bird, the turkeys that are gobbling. So it was a really fun hunt because, I think that was the first time we'd ever hunted together, and it was fun to see what the different things that we key in on and everything. And it definitely made me appreciate the dawn chorus more. But I always remember looking over his gun where he's pointing kind of diagonal from the turkeys, and seeing him check that safety, because it's really uncomfortable when you're with somebody else's shotgun and all that. But man, those things, they didn't worry about it at all. They just kind of came in on a beeline. They went in the strut a few times, just a perfect scenario. And then they walked behind the pine tree, and he kind of adjusted to where he needs to shoot. They walked out from behind it, and I clucked at it. It stuck its head up, and then boom, he just completely crushed it. So, and then
it was pretty easy.
This fella comes driving up literally right after we picked the turkey up. We can see the guy coming down the road in his old van. So really, really fun time and special experience. I'm glad you still have that cape so you can remember it sometimes, but a lot of fun. All right. So now we've kind of lowered everybody's guard, made it a little bit of a lighter mood. But Chris, you know this already, and it kind of goes without saying, but burning during nesting, that causes a visceral response from people, turkey enthusiasts in particular. They get really, really, really upset with the idea that we'd ever consider burning during that time. I think most people agree that burning can be really beneficial to turkeys, but we wanted to come to you because you've been the source of so much information related to this topic, and just let you kind of lay out, use of prescribed fire. What are we getting out of it? And then some of the studies, particularly that you've been the lead PI on, that concern the burn timing as it relates to ground nesting in some of these bird species.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. I think you touched on, I think, where we should always start when we talk about fire and turkeys. And I think we need to make it clear that prescribed burning is one of the most important management activities to improve, create, and maintain turkey habitat, if not the most important. Prescribed burning limits woody encroachment into the mid-story. So when you have woody plants that move into the mid-story, they shade the vegetation near the ground. That's where turkeys live. That's where they nest, and that's where they raise their brood. So that vegetation near the ground can be important, especially for nesting and brooding turkeys. So fire helps maintain that. Fire can help shift that understory community to more herbaceous dominated community, which can be especially important for poults, because they can get that's where they can get a lot of bugs, the invertebrates they need.
Yeah, and I
to
was gonna
grow.
say if you remember the episode that we did with you on the update, and then we've talked to several other people, nesting and brooding cover, and particularly brooding cover, seems to be dramatically limited or in low abundance across the landscape, and sounds like it's the same there where you're at in
Yeah,
North
no, I
Carolina.
100%. No, the thing about nesting cover is that turkeys will, if you've worked with turkeys and you've monitored their nest, they'll nest just about anywhere. But that doesn't mean that's really nesting cover. So when the
Mhm.
turkey's nesting in leaf and pine litter, in the middle of an open forest, that's not a great place for it to conceal its nest. So,
Sure.
but brood cover is a much more specific requirement for turkeys, and it needs to be that herbaceous community. So fire can really help us create and maintain that plant community.
Mhm.
There are other potential values of prescribed fire for turkeys. If you've I've seen this especially in late dormant season burning, so burning in the late winter. You'll see turkeys flock into those areas soon after the fires, maybe even when the ground's still smoking.
Mhm.
And they're obviously going there because there's additional access to certain food resources. Maybe there's exposed um, invertebrates, maybe they're exposed seeds or acorns or other things, but they certainly are attracted to those areas.
Mhm.
So prescribed burning on the landscape is critically important to conserve wild turkeys. So So when we raise concerns about burning during nesting activity, we need to be real careful, because the first thing we need to always do is to recognize that prescribed burning is a critical management tool if we're trying to conserve wild turkeys.
Mhm.
And we should never ever let burning. We should never let concerns about. To me, we should never let concerns about um, affecting turkey reproduction limit our ability to burn to maintain habitat. And I actually hear that from a lot of managers, like, well, I'm not able to burn now because there's too much pushback um, on burning during certain times of the year because of concern about turkeys or some other animal, and that's sort of frustrating.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And to me as a scientist, it's frustrating because there's just not much information to suggest we should be concerned about burning during the nesting season um, with wild turkeys. And I can talk specifically about the work we did at Fort Bragg with wild turkeys. Um, so Fort Bragg is and this is where Marcus did his PhD work, so he can talk about it as much as me. But it's a large military installation that's managed with frequent fire to create and maintain a longleaf pine community. The goal there on Fort Bragg, and we're talking 100 to 150,000 acres. The goal is to burn everywhere at least every 3 years on average. So this is a heavily fire maintained landscape, one of the most heavily or intensively fire managed landscapes in North America, really. So it's a great place to study the potential effects on wild turkeys. The other thing that's sort of specific about Fort Bragg is they really try to do a large portion of their burning in their early growing season in April and May, and we all know that's when turkeys are nesting. So there's a pretty high potential for fire. If you think there's a potential for fire to affect a ground nesting species like turkeys, that would be the place to
Yeah.
study it.
Well, let's reiterate. So we've got 100,000 plus acres where they're trying to put fire on every part of the ground at least every third year,
Yep.
and they are doing a large chunk of that burning during peak nesting time.
So we did a 2 year study on Bragg, and during that 2 year study, they burned 20% of the base during the nesting season.
Yeah, 20%. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that if it was a problem, that's where it would be.
Yeah. So that's where it would be. So we did a 2 year study. We located 42 nests in the 2 years of that study, but some logistical reasons, we only were able to include 30 of those nests in our nest survival monitoring. But of those 30 nests, only one was burned up. So approximately a 3% risk of that turkey nest being burned up on a place that's managed as intensively with fire as you'll find.
Yeah, so
Some
3
interesting
year.
things. So some
Yeah.
interesting things we saw with those turkey nests. Um, Turkeys selected for specific places on the landscape to place those nests, and what we saw was they were primarily selecting what we call the ecotone. So on Bragg, you have the uplands that are longleaf pine communities that are managed with intense, frequent fire. You have the lowlands along the streams and rivers that are moist and are less likely to burn. And then you have these ecotones, which are the transition zones from the lowlands to the uplands. And fire often backs. There's no fire break there, so the managers allow the fire to back into those areas. And so the soil is richer there, so the vegetation response is going to be more prominent, and the vegetation is more lush. So what fire does is when it backs in there, it sort of creates this really nice mix of understory woody and herbaceous cover that's ideal nesting cover for turkeys. So they're selecting those areas over the uplands, but about, I'd say, I think it was 10 of the 30 nests were in the uplands, and the other 20 nests were either in those ecotones or in the straight up bottomlands down there where it's wet. And the 10 nests in the uplands where prescribed fire is mostly happening, only one of those nests was burned up, but 0% of those nests survived. So we can talk about that in a second. The ecotones in the bottomlands where the turkeys were selecting the nest survival, I think, was 65 or 70% in those areas. So it was really high.
Yeah.
So there was a real interesting dichotomy between those lowlands and the uplands.
Chris, one question real quick before you move
Yeah.
on with that. What proportion of the landscape was in that lowland versus or ecotone versus the upland?
It's in our paper. It's like a 80% of the landscape is in the uplands, and the other 20% is either in the ecotone or the lowlands. So a large majority of the landscape is in the uplands.
You had roughly, and we're going to provide this paper in the show notes if you guys want to look at the actual numbers. So let me try to work out that math. You've got about 20% of the landscape associated with the lowland and the ecotone. About 20% of the landscape had about over 60% of the nests.
Yes. Yep. So it's what we would call selection. So the birds are disproportionately placing their nest in different parts of the landscape based on the availability. So if you just thought they were putting their nest randomly, if 20% of the landscape is lowland, 20% of the nest should be in the lowland, but it was a much greater number than that.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, do you think that they were selecting for those areas because the nesting cover was lacking in the uplands? Because I would expect those, if they're burning on basically a 3-year rotation, that by the time those areas, are 2 to 3 years post fire, there should be pretty good cover in those upland areas as well, right?
Yeah, so a couple of caveats here. So this is in the Sandhills physiographic region of North Carolina. So the soils there are relatively poor. So vegetation response post fire is a little slower than you would see on more productive sites. So I think the nesting cover in the uplands probably peaks out certainly 3 years post fire, maybe 2 years post fire. And I call that a 2-year or a 3-year rough. And this isn't important. Unfortunately, we didn't document in what year post fire the turkeys were nesting. So I'll talk about some other studies where we did document that, but I don't know exactly what year post fire the turkeys were nesting. Marcus may have some guesses, but my guess would be it would be 2 and 3 years post fire. The 1 year post fire, the structure is just too sparse.
Right.
The other thing that goes on in Bragg is there's often efforts to reduce the woody component of the understory plant community, which is largely turkey oaks. So their efforts using techniques like herbicides to reduce that woody component. So even in some places, you could go many years post fire and there would still not be anything but wiregrass and maybe some forward cover, which is,
that was one thing.
Turkeys tend to like some woody component in their nesting cover.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was kind of striking to me with my experience at Fort Bragg versus other places is the response, as you said, from the vegetation is not nearly as vigorous as it has been in some other places I've worked where, by year 2, like you burn and then, 2 growing seasons later, I mean, it's a big mess of nesting cover then. And that's not really structurally what I was seeing when I was there either. And I think you were right, Chris, from my recollection of going and looking at a bunch of those nests. It was later on in the, toward the end of the return interval and even probably past it, because there are areas that don't burn for longer than 3 years just because they can't get to all of it or there's some sort of restriction or whatever. So it could have even been longer since fire in some of those cases where you have a little more woody cover development.
So just I guess I could summarize that study in relation to fire. Very, only one nest got burned up by fire,
Hmm.
despite the
So,
sort of aggressive prescribed burning on that landscape.
well, and
The
it's at a
lowland eco,
scale too. That it was at a large scale of burning, and it was
yeah,
in a large portion of the landscape, and a large portion of it was during nesting. So
yep, yep.
you would
So they're
expect,
burning big. They're big burn units. There's a lot of burning, and they're focusing April and May. They don't just burn in April and May. So I
right?
don't want to say that, but that's a primary burn period because that's the
Yeah,
early growing season, and that's when they get really good wiregrass response.
yeah,
Yeah. If I may, there's a couple things that I want to talk about here, and one of those is I think we just brought up an important management implication, and that's that we can make recommendations on fire frequency for landowners to achieve different objectives, and they're really just starting points, right? Because each area is going to respond a little bit differently, and on Fort Bragg, for instance, 3 years post fire, you still may not have enough cover for nesting. Whereas I've seen places like in the Black Belt of Alabama that the year after they're burned, there's plenty
hmm
of visual obstruction from vegetation to conceal a nest.
yeah,
So I think that's important to point out to managers is you need to familiarize yourself with what structure and species composition of understory vegetation you're looking for, and start out with some baseline return interval when it comes to fire, but you have to modify that as time goes on if you're
yeah.
not achieving those results.
Yeah,
I'll
and
go a little further on that. Sorry, Chris. I've worked with fire, and a lot of people, have I've talked to over the years working with that. It's been a big thrust of my programming. Uh, I've heard people get frustrated because we give a range of things and we're not really specific on what. And I've been
Hmm.
working really hard to try to prepare people to understand why there's range in those recommendations, what are the driving factors, so that you can understand in your context how you vary these different factors. And it seems to be more helpful to people when you're preparing them to understand, okay, based on my soil productivity and my burn window and the scale I'm doing it and my objectives, kind of tweaks those recommendations. Whereas, in the past, we may not have been as good at articulating why we don't give a really specific recommendation in every case.
yeah, I agree. Um, and so I we have some I've been involved with some studies of some other ground nesting birds that I think I could talk about that will that we can use as sort of information to bring back to turkeys. But
Hmm.
just to summarize that turkey project that we've been talking about, um, fire is common on landscape. Fire to me was important in maintaining that really ideal nesting cover in that ecotone because without fire, those areas would grow up into
Hmm.
hardwood mid-story stems. Fire in the uplands where woody cover was more sparse may have that frequent fire may have limited the nesting cover that was available to turkeys. So you have to know your site and know your return interval to understand that. So
What
even though
what about with
so
brooding
even though in
cover,
the
Chris?
uplands, even though the turkey nests weren't being burned up, fire could have been sort of reducing that nesting cover in
Yeah.
that specific landscape.
Well,
Yeah, that
what I
was
was going to follow up with, what about the brooding cover in the uplands? Do you think that it was more appropriate or better from that fire regime there?
Yeah, it could be. We didn't monitor that, so it would be speculative, but
Hmm.
that's certainly possible.
Okay.
Yeah, Chris, I think you brought up an important point, and it was one that was on my mind. Is that the fire regime that they were using on that site may not have been conducive to maximizing nesting cover availability in the uplands, and that's why we saw or you saw so many hens nesting in those ecotones. And so my immediate thought is a manager, like if I'm trying to maximize turkey abundance, I want to maximize usable space,
Hmm.
especially for things like nesting that are limiting across the landscape. However, you found that nest success was 60% in those areas, which is almost like threefold of what we're seeing across the average study these days. And that's kind of hard to argue with. And furthermore, the other concern that I had with turkeys nesting there is I'm thinking, well, if these are on ecotones as you're transitioning into bottomland forest, there's probably a greater concentration of nest predators there. But that also didn't seem to play a role based on that 60% success rate.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of those. And so the question would be: are turkeys selecting the ecotones because there's nothing available in the uplands? Or are they selecting those ecotones because they're just straight up high quality nesting cover.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the latter. The other thing is that all those birds are in the ecotone, and some of those areas are pretty wide, so they may not as
Mm-hmm.
be as narrow as we might perceive, where predators may have it easy pickings. Um, but because those ecotones are sort of moist, oftentimes when the fire backs in there, the fire is not complete,
Mm-hmm.
and the nests that are in there may be less susceptible to being burned up by fire. And I
Right.
think a take-home message, in addition to what we've already talked about, and sort of understanding your vegetation response, is if you can create heterogeneity, variability in fire across your landscape, either burning small patches so you don't burn any big area, but also implementing prescribed burns where everything doesn't burn. And
Mm-hmm.
Marcus can tell you, well, y'all both can say that in most cases when we do prescribed burning, we're trying to blacken everything, and I just
Mm-hmm.
think that's not the best thing to do when we're
It's
trying to
hard
manage your
not to
wildlife.
fall. It's
I
hard
know.
not to fall into that trap.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've done
it's
it.
like, oh, look
Hey,
at
there's
this.
something that didn't burn over. Let's
Yeah,
go
look
put
at
some
this
diesel
patch.
fuel on it.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
the other thing I wanted to note, we've gone through a bunch of studies as we've talked about, and Chris alluded to this at the state level, even in North Carolina. The proportion of the landscape in this study, you still said, was up in the 20%
Yeah.
range.
Right.
That is good nesting cover, and that is nearly an order of magnitude higher percentage of the landscape than we're seeing at the
Mm-hmm.
landscape scale, which largely is attributable to fire, for one thing, but also that's another thing to keep in mind with that really high nesting success. There's also a larger proportion of the landscape in that, even though a lot of the uplands aren't usable in that case, it's that fire regime is creating high quality, or presumably high quality, since the hens, they selected it and were super successful when they did, presumably high quality nesting cover in that landscape at far larger proportions than what we're observing in these other studies.
Yes. And Bragg also does, they keep the goal is to keep the forest open, so there's sunlight getting to the
Mm,
ground. So those things go together. If you just burn in a closed canopy forest, you're just throwing your money out the window. So you got to have sunlight getting through your forest canopy, and then that's where fire becomes important.
yeah. Well, Chris, I don't want to hold you up any farther. I know you got some other good data, so we
Yeah.
keep
So
going back to that one.
just so we've also studied a species called Bachman sparrow, and Bachman sparrow is a songbird that is associated with frequently burned lonely pine communities, and it nests and feeds on the ground and herbaceous cover. So it's a very fire adapted species, but it nests on the ground, and it nests at a similar time to turkeys. So you would think, again, burning during the early growing season would be a potential risk to that species. And we tracked 132 nests over several years in North Carolina on Fort Bragg, and also on some other properties in the southeastern part of the state. So over a very large region that included a variety of different public lands that were managed with fire. And we had only 2 of those 132 Bachman sparrow nests that were burned up. So less than 2%. So just a tiny fraction. So this
Wow.
2 out of that big number. So you're like, okay, why are more Bachman sparrow nests not being burned up when there's burning in April and May, and Bachman sparrows are nesting in April and May? And Bachman sparrows don't nest in lowlands. They don't nest in ecotones. They
Yeah, that
nest only in the uplands. So here's what happens. You burn in one year, and then the next year, what I call the 1-year-old rough, is the ideal condition for Bachman sparrows. So a large percentage of the Bachman sparrows are nesting in the 1-year rough.
So in other words, they're nesting, and even though they're in the upland, they are nesting in a part of the fire return interval where it is very unlikely for
Yes.
fire to re-enter the system during the year that the nesting occurred.
The only way those birds would be at risk of being burned up by fire is if you had an annual fire regime where you were burning every year.
Mm-hmm.
So even, it sort of starts to peter off after that first year. So there's still a lot of birds nesting in the 2-year-old rough, and then there are very few birds nesting in the 3-year-old rough. And on most of these lands, there's a 3-year return interval. So when the burners are coming in April and May, they're burning a 3-year-old rough, and there aren't any Bachman sparrows there. Just to continue, we did a similar study with northern bobwhite, again on Fort Bragg, and we tracked, nearly 50 nests in a similar kind of landscape. Only two only 2 northern bobwhite nests were burned up by fire. Again, they're nesting. Northern bobwhite nest on the ground. On Fort Bragg, northern bobwhite largely nest in the 2-year-old rough. Now, if we went to a richer location like you guys may be familiar with, quail may be nesting in the 1-year-old rough, but on Fort Bragg, they nest primarily in the 2-year-old rough. So again, with a 3-year return interval, bobwhite are not susceptible to being, their nests are not susceptible because relatively few of those birds are nesting in the 2-year-old rough.
What,
The other
Chris?
advantage that quail have in terms of that April and May burn regime is that quail nesting really picks up in June. So quail are nesting later in the
Mm,
season, and if you're burning in April and May, you're just not. There's just very low chance you're going to burn up a quail nest.
yeah. Well, Chris, one thing I wanted to ask you, you were talking about this strong selection. I just wanted to get a feel for like how strong of selection for the Bachman sparrow and the bobwhites. Like I know that you said that they nest in the 2-year rough, but like what proportion?
Ooh.
Like, are we talking about like 90% or 60%? What is how strong is that selection?
I could look that number up. It it's
Well, we'll provide the paper so they can get the actual number.
Yeah,
But do you have a?
it's not 90%. So there is some
Yeah.
variability, and even
Okay.
some of the Bachman sparrows are nesting. They're nesting the same year as fire.
Okay.
So
So even when it's skewed to earlier or even less likely that fire enters than later. Would
yes,
you say that?
yes,
Okay.
um, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
So,
that's
Chris,
really interesting stuff.
So I have the numbers for you here. So for Bachman sparrows, 70% of their nests are in that 1-year-old rough, 20% in the 2, and 7% in the 3. So
okay.
there's 7% of the nests that are potentially susceptible to being burned up. But even then, the chance that the fire happens the same time the nest happens in the nesting season is pretty small. For bobwhite, 50% of the birds are nesting in the 2-year-old rough, 20% in the 1, 20% same year, and then 12% in the 3-year. So the point is that on Fort Bragg, if you shifted to a 2-year return interval, you might put more nest at risk of quail. But again, the quail are typically nesting um, after the burn season. So
Yeah. So, Chris, can you say the ones that chose how many chose to nest in the same year as fire versus the 3rd year?
for quail,
Yeah, the
it was
ones that you
about
just
20% in the same year as fire and about 12% in the 3-year.
okay.
And of
So
course, people are like, "Why? What are they doing this?" They're doing this because these birds are queuing in on the vegetation
yeah.
that's coming back after the fire. So this is all driven by the condition of the vegetation. Um,
Well,
and
that was
yeah,
the thing I was going to kind of get at is even in that case, if you burn during nesting or I guess directly before it for quail, they still would use that is making that space
yeah,
more usable for nesting, at least based on those percentages, than not burning because you're worried about nesting, which is kind of an interesting thing.
potentially it probably depends on the timing of that same year's fire. If it was a dormant season burn on Bragg, there would have been several months
Hmm.
of green up that would have happened before they nested. So if you burn in May, they're going to have less time for green up.
Sure, but they might brood in
They
into
may.
something else.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's really interesting.
So, Chris, it sounds pretty clear from your data on northern bobwhites, on turkeys, on Bachman sparrows, that on those particular sites there wasn't a high exposure of nests to fires. They weren't regularly destroyed. But we have a lot of listeners that reach out to us that hunt large public tracts of land that send us pictures of burn up nests all the time. Obviously they don't have transmitters on birds, so they're just coming across these nests, somewhat randomly. And for the number of pictures that they have, it's almost baffling to me to think that this isn't occurring on a fairly regular basis on some sites. Can you think of any combination of site characteristics that might lead to burning during that time of the year impacting more nests?
Yeah, you could think of the worst case scenario where all the nests are concentrated in the sort of parts of the landscape that get burned. Okay, number one, the birds the birds are nesting at the same time burning is happening. So this would be burning in April and May during the nesting season. Large portions of that landscape are being burned every year, and I mean large, at
Hmm.
least 20 to 30%. there was one other point I can't remember what I was going to say, but so large portions of the landscape, complete burns within those burn units.
Mm-hmm.
The birds are all concentrated. Oh, the other thing was the return interval, so that the timing of the return interval is so that um, the areas where birds are nesting in those burn units is the same time that they would be scheduled to be burned. So there are a lot of things that have to happen. Big area gets burned. The birds are all concentrated in areas that do get burned. The burns are very complete. The burning is at the same time as nesting, and then the return interval, and so the return interval sort of matches up when the birds are there. So if you had all the birds concentrated in that 2-year-old rough, 2 years post fire, and you had a 2-year return interval, then that's a lot of
So,
things that have to line up
well, this is
for you to have
something.
this concern. And even then, there's the chance that the nesting and the burning just don't happen at the same time.
Yeah. Well, Chris, uh, as someone who constantly takes heat over this topic, I get asked about burning and nesting on most of the podcasts I get invited on. I would say
That
I
was a
have to
nice
address
pun, by
that.
the way, Marcus.
What's
I
that?
catch a lot of heat on this.
Oh yeah, I didn't even mean that to be a pun, but there you go.
It worked.
Sometimes it happens. Yeah. So I see the photos go viral online, and everybody gets really mad, and then they all throw, wherever they turkey hunt, they throw their management strategies under the bus because of the timing, and then the one nest that goes viral and all that. So, and I think you did a good job of kind of laying that out. But one of the ways I have presented that, and I just wanted you to kind of lay it out from your perspective. One of the things that I have commonly said is that a lot of the burning that we do at that time is it's often because we have a limited burn window, and a lot of times we're behind on burning, and we're trying to expand the burn window to increase the amount of acreage. And that often occurs in areas that have been out of the fire regime a little bit too long, which is getting into unusable space, especially for turkeys, where they were nesting and brooding and much earlier in the fire regime. And if we're 5, 6, 7 years out, in most cases, we're probably already out of usable space for them. So can you just kind of talk about that for a minute from your perspective with all your experience with
Yeah.
the data? Like,
So
is
yeah.
that
So
true? Is that what
yeah.
you think?
The scenario I laid out where all those factors have to come into play. I mean, is there a place like that? There may be some places like that. They're probably primarily on public lands. Um, but I don't know of any place like that where all those things come together like that. Generally, we're not burning much at all in the landscape. We're burning tiny little fractions of the landscape.
Mhm.
Even on some public lands, we just need to do more burning. We've already established that burning is really good for turkeys. Um, and on public lands, in the defense of those public land managers, they have multiple objectives. They're not managing solely for turkeys. And so, in many cases, they're managing for multiple species that benefit from fire. So they're trying to get their burning done when they can get it done. We really need to keep our burn windows open as much as possible. We need every day to be a burn day if possible. So if we start to restrict because we're worried about turkeys, we're worried about quail, worried about timber rattlesnakes, and the next thing you know, we don't have any burn windows. So
Mhm.
it's frustrating if we limit our burn windows because of these vast concerns.
Well, and particularly if it's an area that has not been in the fire return interval, and we're trying to get fire back in it, and maybe that occurs during mid-April or something like that. People get really bent out of shape out of it for burning during nesting when it's a place that's not usable for nesting.
Right. So again, that we need to burn to
Yeah,
create habitat for turkeys. So the
right. So
turkeys
it's
aren't even
actually
nesting there if it's not habitat.
so
And
even
even if
even
you,
that.
it's most likely a small percentage of the landscape. And then the last thing I'll say is, okay, yeah, we all know turkey nests get burned up. We documented a turkey nest getting burned up, but turkeys will renest, and they have a very high propensity for renesting.
Mhm.
Some studies, maybe very high, at least 50% renesting rate.
Well,
So turkeys are evolved that if a nest burns up, they can go somewhere else, especially if you have that variability across the landscape where there's other places that have nesting cover, or if you're leaving unburned patches within your burn units where they could renest.
mhm. That's a really good point. Another thing, Chris, and you can comment on it if you want to or whatever, but it's really curious to me that we have a whole bunch of bird species like turkeys and bottnest sparrows and northern bobwhites that nest on the ground in places that are super flammable during the time frame that they were really flammable and on fire all the time.
Yeah. No, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. These birds are evolved to fire adapted systems, and they thrive in those systems. So
Mm-hmm.
certainly, yeah, they
And
persisted with
and
fire.
those
They persisted with fire millennia ago. They persisted with fire that was much more frequent and large scale, based on all the evidence we have.
yeah,
And those populations were
and it
robust.
co-occurred with when they nest.
Yes. Yeah.
So that is really curious to me. No, that's not to say that we may create conditions that are relatively unnatural that could cause some issues potentially, but it is very eye-opening to think of it from the adaptations of those species in the systems that they develop those adaptations. It's really curious that they would still nest on the ground during that time frame when most of the fire apparently was occurring on the landscape, across the landscape, but and they still do that.
Yeah. I will say, if you're a private landowner and you're listening and you're like, okay, is it okay for me to burn during the nesting season? I think you need to think about all the things, all those factors I laid out. And if you're burning small units, if you really need to get some burning done, if you're burning at a time when the turkeys, at a place and a time when the turkeys are not likely nesting, it's not a problem, and you really need to burn. Dormant season is a great option to burn if you can do. I mean, I love. I'm very supportive of dormant season burning, so we don't have to nest and we don't have to burn in April and May.
Right. It's more about if you need to get more burning done, and you don't necessarily discount that part of the burn window over
Absolutely
that.
not.
Yeah,
Absolutely not.
and that's one thing that I always want to make clear is the problem, in areas where turkey's declining is almost never that there's too much fire. It's probably quite the opposite, that there's too little
Right.
fire.
Exactly. There you go. You've summed it up.
Yeah.
All right, we
That's
done
it.
here?
That's it. You just nailed it. And there's just no scientific evidence to show that burning, even during the growing season, is causing large scale reductions in reproduction. Maybe there's a place and that meets all those criteria I laid out, and some researcher will go in and document it, and
Mhm.
it'll be a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
And it just tells us that we need to know our focal species. We need to know the natural history of our focal species. We need to know how the vegetation responds to fire, and then we need to appropriately implement fire to benefit that species with those sort of potential caveats of concern in mind.
Mhm.
Yeah, one of the questions that I get, or I guess more of a comment directed at me, is that there's certain individuals that are tired of hearing it's worth burning up a nest this year in the promise of producing more turkeys next year. Um, and they think that that's never the case. But when we see these data being produced, um, showing how limiting nesting and brooding cover is across the landscape, how strongly hens select for that, combined with how much greater nest success and poult survival is associated with those areas, yes, it is absolutely worth giving up a couple nests
Yeah.
occasionally this year in the promise of more turkeys next
I
year,
I
because we
would
have data that shows it happens.
I would
So,
say giving up 1 out of 30 is a no-brainer.
yep.
But the other thing, I'll take that even a step further, Will. A lot of places in the South, at least, are good brooding areas during the year of fire, so you might
Hmm.
not even be giving up a year. You may be giving up a nest of eggs to improve brooding success from many.
Yeah, it's a good point.
So, yeah, I agree with you, and I've taken plenty of, heat, I think was the pun I used earlier ago, but, uh, yeah, over this topic, but I think that that's something that people need to stay in consideration,
Listen, it's
keep
a
in
real
control.
thing. I mean, I
Yeah.
was at a national fire training a couple of weeks ago, and several the eastern most of the fire managers are western, but even the western ones. I asked them, like, what are some of your major barriers to implementing prescribed burning, and almost to the T, it's some animal. And in the east, it's often turkeys, because constituents for these public land managers are anti-burning because they perceive that there's some detriment from burning up nests, when in fact we need to be doing more burning to benefit those same species. So
Mhm. Yeah, it's
yeah,
really, really interesting. it's definitely a divisive issue, and you know, we have tried to take it directly on. So hopefully everybody appreciates that out there. And
Yeah, and I'm always open for questions or conversations. Yeah, and
And
it goes for rough grouse. I mean, these things apply to any of the ground nesting species.
mhm.
It,
yeah, and especially I think it speaks to this issue at a broader scale when you look at the data that shows, you know, avian species across the board are generally declining with a few exceptions. I think like waterfowl is one of those exceptions. But when you start really honing in on the grassland and the shrubland species, that guild is in greater experiencing greater declines than any other. And this
Mhm.
is a practice that maintains and creates habitat for those birds. So I mean, right then and there is your indicator that there's something that's lacking from the landscape that was previously there, and I think a lot of that is this disturbance process of fire.
Well,
absolutely.
and here's some. We'll use another pun. Here's something that'll get people fired up out there. Another sound bite, so to speak. Uh, how many of these folks that are getting really bent out of shape about burning and burning during nesting and you know commenting on this and everything online have a bunch of soot on their hind end because those same people are hunting in these places in the recently burned area where all the gobbling is occurring and chasing turkeys in that burned area because that you know that we have very clear data to show that a recently burned area is a really good place to try to find a gobbler. And I think a lot of these people are probably utilizing that and benefiting from it from their hunting experience, and then at the same time really upset that we have potentially, exposed the bird to fire during nesting. So, that's something for you all to reflect on.
That's a good point, Marcus, and it was one that I was kind of thinking about as we were going through this. If, you know, knowing nothing else about the site, if you give me two pieces of public land that I have a choice to try to go kill a turkey on, and you tell me that one is burning a third of the uplands every year and another one is burning much less than that, I'm going to pick the one to go hunt that's burning more often.
Every time.
Ditto.
Yeah, I have personally, and I think I even told you it was my favorite color. Will that the color of a really fired up gobbler on a backdrop of char right after daylight and fly down? It's a beautiful thing.
Is that a color?
Well, I don't. We there is a color or a suite of colors associated with that, but it's that setting is a pretty special thing for me
Well,
mentally.
fair enough. I said my favorite color was iridescent, so
Yeah. Well, I don't think people realize out there how difficult all this is, to get on the microphone and be live when we're trying to go through all this. So
yeah.
I'm going to forgive you for saying iridescence is your favorite color.
I appreciate that. I lost a little bit of sleep the past few nights thinking about it, Marcus.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. That's
So
what
your
you were looking.
forgiveness is welcome.
Yeah, well, at least you didn't lose your sleep over burning during nesting.
Right. Nope. I'm not losing sleep over that.
Yeah.
No,
Well, Chris, is there any other take home messages or anything you'd like to leave folks with that are still listening?
no. I think the take home message from all three of us is to get out there and burn, support burning. Um, Typically, we're burning too little, so any sort of concerns about a lost individual are going to be much outweighed by the benefit to the population.
Yeah. All right. Well, like we said, everybody, thanks for listening. Thanks for helping us share this and rating. Our audience has been so engaged in it and giving us so much feedback. We really appreciate all that, and please keep it coming. We're letting that drive some of the topic areas that we're covering, like this one. We get so many questions about this particular issue. So thanks everybody for doing that. Chris, we'll try to list all of these paper links, and I know you have several of them, so we'll try to list all those so that people have direct access. And if they want to reach out to you with questions, what's the best way for people to do that?
Yeah, just send me an email. It's moorman@ncsu.edu. I'm happy to respond to emails, and I'll send you guys the three papers that I talked about in terms of fire and ground nesting birds. We have a fourth paper on turkeys that looked at hen pre-nesting resource selection. And again, fire was an important predictor, a beneficial
Yeah.
predictor of
Okay.
hen habitat use before the nesting season.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll include that one as well. So great stuff.
Yep. One other thing I want to mention before we go is Turkeys for Tomorrow has confirmed that for listeners that leave a review, we're going to start, having a random drawing periodically, maybe once or twice a month, and we're going to send those listeners a TFT hat if they get us their information. So make sure you do that, and we'll start drawing those names here pretty soon.
Yeah, maybe we could coincide that with turkey season.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, yeah. So, thanks everybody for all your engagement. There's already a whole bunch of questions, Will. I don't know if you've gone and looked in our reviews of the podcast, but a bunch of people already did that. So thanks,
Yep.
Thanks everybody. You're helping us spread the word, and we really appreciate that.
Thanks, guys.
Thank y'all. See you.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.